David, it's great to be talking to you about your programs over in Boston and the knowledge that you can share with us. Just wondering if you can talk a bit more about the common myths around abusers.
Well, I think that the first one is that I think that abusers are easy to identify. You know, I think most abusers, really 3/4 of them, really don't present as abusive in their relationships with other people other than their partners and their children, maybe. So that I think that we kind of keep looking for guys that kind of spout off towards other people in their lives, but the majority of abusers don't do that. You know, and so I think that there's just enough of the guys that do do that those are the ones we keep looking for.
Okay, so what might, I guess, people or agencies working with abusers look for to identify?
Well, I think that we really need to sort of listen to victims, too, and so that victims are often, calling out for help and calling attention to abusive behavior, and I think that sometimes we don't want to believe them because it doesn't fit our own experience with the abuser, and in fact he may have a more charming, presentable persona, than the victim, and those especially cases when sometimes people don't want to believe the victim.
So he comes across as a lot more believable.
Yes.
Than what you would.
That's right, and more credible in a way.
Yeah. So are there some common traits that you would identify?
Well, I think that probably. Many of abusers really do come across as charming and helpful to other people. I think that in their private life and sometimes in their work life, they are self-centered, and I think because of that, they often see themselves as victims, and because they tend to sort of really kind of think of, they put a lot of stock in what they contribute to relationships, and a lot of times they diminish what they're getting back, and I think the end result of that is they often see themselves as victims, and they're actually quite successful at presenting themselves as victims, sometimes.
So the self-centeredness, you've described as a narcissistic personality.
Yes.
Yeah, so what would be some of the ways people might identify that's what they're, what type of personality they are? Well,
I think that if they sort of present a one-sided view of the problems, so sometimes they're very good at sort of diverting attention away from themselves and the alleged problems, the violence, the abusive behavior, and diverting attention onto the victim's behavior. I think that they may present as somebody who see themselves as superior, or more intelligent than their partner. I think that sometimes they can be grandiose, and inflate their accomplishments in general. Not always, some of them are actually quite, presentable in terms of how they kind of express themselves and acknowledge other people. Not their partners necessarily, but towards other people.
I heard someone use an expression once, they'd never heard an abuser that didn't sound like a victim.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I think they really do see themselves as victims, and I think it does sort of come from their narcissistics, or their narcissism, because they tend to sort of feel shortchanged in a sense, because they kind of like, again, they think that they're giving more than they're getting. In their interactions with their partners.
And would that heighten their sense of betrayal if the victim starts calling police, talking outside the home of what's going on?
Yeah. They often see things in terms of disloyalty. So if their partner is alleging abuse, or they see that as betrayal of themselves.
David, what's your response when there's comments about, what about the men in respect to men as victims of domestic violence?
Well, I mean, I think we certainly have to acknowledge that exists, that there are men who are abused by their female partners. I don't think it exists anywhere near to the degree that that there are women who are abused by their male partners too. But when you do have a case of a woman abusing their partner, they tend to have the same characteristics. So I don't think it's inherently a male purview, to be an abuser. I don't know the exact proportions, but my sense is that it's quite a bit less.
Okay. So if men are presenting as victims, to ensure safety, how do you ascertain that they are the victim?
Well, first of all, many abusers present themselves, very convincingly sometimes as victims, and so that seems to be a part of their identity almost, how they see themselves, how they present themselves, so that, certainly we have to ask them, to give examples of interactions they've had, with their partner. We try to look at who has control in the relationship, who has the resources in the relationship, who is afraid, whose self-esteem, whose independence is being undermined, by the other person, and quite often I think the initial look sometimes, is deceptive. I mean, sometimes women are arrested for violence, towards their male partners who, in fact, are the victim, in these relationships, because they're the one whose self-esteem, whose independence, whose autonomy is being undermined, by their partner.
And that's what we see. So it's doing those assessments to see who is the victim.
Yes.
And you talked about identifying the primary aggressor. The
primary aggressor, yeah. I mean, in police work, that's what the term is that we use, and so sometimes you have to sort of look beyond kind of the presenting, behavior that's been alleged, and look at kind of the history in the relationship in terms of who's undermining who.
So probably would follow on from that then is how do people actually improve their practice to ensure they don't collude with abusers when they're working with them?
Well, I think sort of, I like to talk about increasing our IQ about the excuses that abusers typically employ, so that I think that we all are vulnerable, to accepting and in fact even reinforcing wittingly or unwittingly some of those excuses, so that abusers commonly, allege that their abusive behavior has been provoked by the victim. So there's an example, I think, where we could sort of unwittingly end up reinforcing that in some way. I think sometimes abusers blame stress, they blame alcohol, as somehow having contributed to the problem. I think sometimes they say that they just lost control, and I think that it really matters how we respond, because quite often they will they will interpret our responses as agreement with them, for instance. Even our silence sometimes can be interpreted as agreement, so that I think it's important to sort of become savvy about what are those excuses and what are kind of more constructive ways of responding to them, that really communicate the message that you're responsible for your own behavior and your victim didn't provoke you, it's still a choice for you, your behavior, and some choices are a lot better than others. That even though you may be under stress, that also doesn't cause you to be violent. Alcohol doesn't cause a person to be violent, and if you're violent when you're drinking, you're still responsible for your behavior, and so forth. I mean, that's the sort of thing you really expect of friends. Friends, are supposed to call each other, on your behavior, are supposed to sort of hold each other to a higher standard, so to speak.
Is it also being aware that what counsellors and therapists might say to an abuser can actually be taken and used against their partner?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that counselors sometimes lack training on domestic violence, and so as a result, they sometimes will end up responding in a way that really kind of promotes a wrong understanding of what the problem is. So, for instance, they might sort of see domestic violence as a matter of dysfunctional communication, as a communicational problem between the partners, rather than seeing it as being a power and control issue, a situation where one person is exerting control and coercion over the other person.
So could that then be some of the, I guess, warnings around couple counselling?
Well, I think that couples counselling is completely inappropriate in cases of domestic violence. I think that one is that it's confusing, because in couples counseling you pretty much have to focus on both parties, and kind of assign responsibility to both parties. And yet in a domestic violence situation, one party is exerting control over the other party. I also think that it puts the victim in a no-win situation, because on the one hand she's expected to open up and to talk openly, but on the other hand, if she does that, she puts herself at risk, for being abused.
And would that be the same, David, around mediation around children, who has children, access to children?
I would have the same concerns about that, because I think, again, the victim may feel pressured into participating in a process that really, in which she sort of gives up some of her rights, in exchange for safety, so that I think that the safest course is for an advocate to be assigned to the victim, so that the advocate can talk to her about what her rights are, and talk to her about her safety in the situation and what's in her best interest.
So just in your experience, if you're conducting your risk assessments, you talked in the training about some of the more predominant indicators.
Of risk, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, I think that one of the risk factors is threats. So if a person has really made threats to harm the partner or even to kill the partner, that's a clear indicator. We used to think about threats as just blowing off steam. Now we think of them more as plans of action. So that it has been found in research that victims of homicide are much more likely than other victims of domestic violence to previously have been threatened by their abusers. So that's one risk factor, is threats. Another one is past use of weapons. So if the person has used weapons to scare or intimidate, the victim, that's certainly an indicator. Past strangulation is another one. I think that quite often victims of homicide have previously been strangled by their partners. I think that use of alcohol and drugs, also is a risk factor, and then also stalking. And that can consist of spying on the victim, surveilling her activities, engaging in acts of intimidation, destroying her property, standing outside of her property. It can consist of calling her many times a day, texting her, and it can involve use of phones and computers to monitor her communication with other people, and so forth.
David, in the research that you did with the women who were almost victims of homicide,
Right.
Did any of those women consider that stalking was as serious as it is?
Well, I think that what many of them reported was that after they had ended the relationship or attempted to end the relationship, there had really been a kind of an escalation of threatening, harassing behavior, as well as surveilling kinds of activities. So that some of their partners spied on them. Some of them followed them around. Some of them showed up at their workplaces. Some of them called them continuously throughout the day, in the middle of the night, and so forth. So that many of them did see that as being
as constituting stalking. In some cases, women saw that as being harassment, which it also is, but also there's a kind of a surveillance aspect to that as well.
Because in the research of Gondorf, he talks about the women's own perception of the threats to be considered as well.
Yes.
What they're thinking about the threats.
Well, in general, women are pretty good. I think victims are pretty good at kind of evaluating risk and danger. I think, though, that it can be improved even, by asking them specific questions about, different risk factors, and maybe they have not have thought of before. Strangulation, I think, is one of them. They may have thought of it as his pressing against her throat, or putting her in a headlock. She may not have thought of that as having been strangled, for instance,
Or using choking.
Or, yeah, she may think it was referred to as choking.
In Massachusetts, is that a crime? Do you have a crime of strangulation?
Yes, strangulation would be considered, it can be considered an act of aggravated assault, particularly if it's led to injury.
David, in talking about men's programs, whether they're court mandated or partner mandated, what are some of the issues around engagement if they don't want to be there?
Well, I think that is the biggest challenge, because I think that regardless of whether they're voluntary or court mandated, quite often they're under pressure. It could be their partner who's kind of in a sense mandated them to attend the program, and so as a result, I think they're sometimes angry. They sometimes feel that they've been railroaded. They are defensive. They don't want to open up. They don't want to admit problems. They're distrusting, of the program. They think of us as an extension of the court. So I think that is our challenge. Our challenge is to really sort of help them to see how the program can be beneficial to them. How it can really help them to have better relationships with their partners and their children. We always say that the court can order you to attend the program, but it can't really order you to get anything out of the program. So if your intent is to really kind of win, in the sense of not really learning anything, then we can't prevent that. That's up to you. We hope that you do. We hope that you do decide to get something in the program, because it's certainly a lot easier if you're open, and want to learn, but only you can decide that.
And is that some of the benefits you'd see of running a 40-week program?
It is, yeah. I think that there's a longer period in which they can sort of overcome, their distrust, their kind of like defensiveness, and really sort of settle back. And I think over time, a lot of the men really do come to see that we really have their best interests in mind, that we're really there to help them to have better relationships, and I think you see that opening up. You see men sort of overcoming their anger and defensiveness, and really kind of joining with us, really, and helping us to help them.
So what would you think about short-term programs?
Well, I think that it's really hard, to, over the course of a short program, to really know, whether a person is sincere in their efforts. I think you have some people who kind of hold their breath, for 10 or 12 weeks. They don't want to say anything that might get them kicked out of the program. They don't show their true colors, in a sense, over 12 weeks. I think that's harder, to do that over about 26 weeks or over 40 weeks. You get a more real indication of what the person's real, feelings and attitudes are, over a longer period of time. There's also a time where they can sort of overcome their defensiveness and really kind of settle down and kind of like begin to make use of the program over a longer period.
So how important is it that do you see to keep partners engaged while they're in the...
Well, I think that's really important. I think there's really no substitute for that. We reach out to the partners, and that really helps us to know how honest is he being with us, is he misrepresenting the program to her, for one thing. He may be telling her that the program's philosophy is that, she's responsible, for his behavior, somehow, which is completely inaccurate, so, it's important for us to kind of level the playing field in a sense, because, if he is giving her this information about the program, then that's really going to hurt her, and we tell her our philosophy is that he is solely responsible for his own abusive behavior. You're not responsible for that to any degree. We tell her our philosophy is that his abusive behavior is a choice, that he's making, and we tell her she doesn't deserve to be abused, too. So there's a validation that we offer to victims when we reach out to them. And we respect the information we get from them, too. It's confidential. We don't repeat that information to other people. It's very useful for us to find out what her concerns are about the relationship, what are her concerns about his parenting of the children. Is he respecting any limits that she's placing on the relationship? Is he still pressuring her in any degree? Is he trying to control her economically? Is he guilt tripping her? So those are all things that really kind of matter to us. And again, I think abusers will kind of minimize sometimes and not report abusive or controlling behavior. So it does help for us to hear from the victim about that.
I like what you were saying, David, about the reports back to the referring agency. It's more than just a report of him and how great he's doing. And
that's right, yeah. Yeah, so we report back about his attendance. We report back about the quality of his participation, so that, and what we mean by that is he being open, is he willing to talk about himself? Is he willing to report his ongoing interactions with his partner's children? So is he willing to talk about problems, he's having, in his relationship? That counts for a lot, because obviously if he's not reporting problems, then we can't help him, right? And then another aspect of the participation is he providing useful feedback to others? Is he actively participating in the exercises? Is he open to learning? And is he providing useful, constructive feedback to others? Or on the other hand, is he commiserating with their excuses? Is he kind of like bonding with them over their complaints about their partners and so forth? So that we really look at both aspects of that. The willingness to talk about one's own problems, and also the willingness to kind of actively participate.
And that sounds like a good system that's going to get around that collusion of facilitators writing reports that are more what the guy's wanting them to say.
Well, right. I think that sometimes, with some of the weaker programs, you have, reports that are very vague or not very specific with regards to his participation, or maybe overly optimistic about them, too. Making statements like he takes responsibility for his abusive behavior. We don't know that a person is taking responsibility for their abusive behavior. All we know is what he says in the group. We don't know for sure whether in fact he's taking responsibility, so that, it's our job to actually be a little bit skeptical about that, too, and to, certainly to report problems that we're seeing if, for instance, he is blaming his partner. If 6 weeks into the program, 8 weeks in the program, 12 weeks into the program, he is still blaming his partner for his own abusive behavior, we will want to include that in a report. We will want to document that he's doing that, because that is an indicator that maybe he's more likely to fail the program, and to reoffend. If he's still minimizing his abusive behavior, 8 weeks, 12 weeks into the program, we will document that, too. So everybody, deserves a shot at change, but if they're really not using that, appropriately, they can't have it both ways. They can't attend a program, but then continue to kind of like misuse that program or kind of not take advantage of that program at the same time.
So what would be some of the biggest challenges you've found that emerge?
Well, I think that the biggest overall challenge is really kind of overcoming resistance, and really sort of having the right balance between, I think, support and confrontation, too. I think it really varies a lot, I think different men sort of seem to need a different balance between those two things, you know. But I do think that the biggest challenge, even bigger than that, is the rest of the system. I think sometimes, you know, we feel that we are really engaging the men in a process of accountability for the behavior and taking responsibility. And sometimes the other parts of the systems aren't supporting what we're trying to do with them, either because they're so busy or they're just looking at, you know, the kind of the legal aspects of the behavior, and so that from our perspective, it really matters a lot whether a person is actively participating in the program, you know, and sometimes, for instance, a probation officer may only care about whether he is attending the program, you know, or whether he, you know, has reoffended, you know. So that I think it works better if the other parts of the system are really joining with us and reinforcing the same expectations, you know, that we have.
And being clear about the same outcomes.
That's right, yeah.
In looking at programs, what might be some of the dangers of using anger management programs for men for violent?
Well, anger management programs were never designed for domestic violence situations. You know, they're really designed for instances of violence or anger towards other people, non-partners. So road rage, violence towards coworkers, barroom brawls, even violence towards siblings, for instance. So they're really designed for that, and they're designed for problems of how one manages anger. The problem with applying that to domestic violence is that domestic violence is not about anger for the most part. It includes anger, so that is one part of the problem. But domestic violence is more about control than anger. So a lot of what abusers do doesn't necessarily involve these moments of rage. A lot of times it's more about controlling the money. It's about isolating the victim socially. It's about damaging her self-esteem. Being critical. So there's a whole range of coercive controls that don't necessarily involve anger or displays of anger.
There's a lot of people that still see it as a brain snap, even when there's a homicide.
Right. Yes, they do, and yet that's really not an accurate, view of the situation. I think that sometimes we see these homicides as a kind of a jealous husband who snaps, for instance. But what I found in my research was that these men had always been extremely possessive in their relationships, had always been extremely jealous and controlling in their relationships, and so that the homicide was really pretty much a culmination of that long-standing behavior on their part.
David, would you think that the most of the men that come into the programs consider their behaviour abuse, or are they shocked when they learn the depths of it?
Well, our goal is to kind of help them to identify and broaden their understanding about what abusive behavior is. Most of them have a very kind of narrow definition about violent and abusive behavior, so they may think that they haven't abused her because they haven't, hit her like a man, so that's what some of the men say, or maybe some of them say that they've never put their hands on her, but they've put holes in walls and damaged property and thrown things at her and so forth, so that really, we're, part of our goal is to kind of help them to see that a lot of behavior they've engaged in is abusive because it creates fear, it's intimidating, and it's damaging, to the other person, not just in terms of physical injuries, but psychological effects, too. I think part of why they don't see themselves, as abusers is some of them are very self-centered, and they actually see themselves as victims, they kind of have this because they have this sort of sense of entitlement, or they have this sort of kind of inflated sense of how they're contributing to the relationship. They feel somehow that they are, and they're devaluing, what the victim and what the partner is giving to them. The end result of that is they somehow feel like they're victims, in the relationship, and present themselves as victims, when in fact, they are, the abusers. So part of how we try to work with them is to kind of get them to see things from their partner's perspective, and to recognize that they have engaged in behavior that is very, damaging. It's very frightening, and it's very selfish, behavior.
I'm wondering if there's a term that you might agree with that might be like controlled rage. We had a sports star here who trashed his penthouse and destroyed a massive amount of property, including trashing a grand piano. But it was all her property.
Yeah.
None of it was his. It was all her property.
Right,
but it was actually explained away as that he was in a rage.
Right, and yet if it was a true rage, then he wouldn't have been so selective, in terms of what he damaged. He wouldn't have just chosen her things, he would have damaged his own property as well. But that sort of shows how selective it really is, and so every abuser sort of draws the line somewhere and has certain things he never does, and so that sort of tells us that, that it's really not about losing control, it's more about being in control, and wanting to teach her a lesson, so to speak.
So how do we get messages out that is still domestic violence?
Damaging property, you mean?
Damaging property, being selective about damaging property, that it's not just a drunken rage.
Well, I mean, it's very intimidating behavior, it's very frightening behavior, it's oftentimes a message, that they're giving you, you're next, I mean, I could be doing this to you, too. I think that, again, it's not what the intentions are, it's what the impact is, what the consequences of the behavior. We have to judge people by the consequences of their behavior, not what their intentions are,
Mm-hmm. Just back with the programs, what would you consider best practice around men's programs?
Well, I think there's a lot of things that go into providing really accountable behavior, accountable programming, for domestic violence. I think that there needs to be outreach to victims. I think there needs to be proper training of group leaders, supervision of practices. I think there needs to be, regular reporting to referral sources. I think there needs to be collaboration with victim programs. I think there needs to be a coherent program, that holds people responsible, for their abusive behavior. There needs to be transparency of the program, so that people know what's being done, and know what they can expect, from the program.
Are they some of the things that might form part of accreditation?
Yes, I think, with accreditation, I think that there need to be stakeholders, that include people that work with victims, that include representatives of the criminal justice system, that have a stake in these types of programs, and I think that all voices need to be considered, with this, and I think that hopefully the result of that is a program that really, has a goal of protecting victims' safety, maintaining victim safety, and holding abusers accountable for their behavior.
David, how important do you see interagency, both cooperation and collaboration, in working with men to reduce their violence?
Oh, it's hugely important. I think every every discipline, has its unique role to play in holding abusers accountable for their behavior. So that starting with police officers, writing detailed reports, that document abusive, violent behavior is important. Those become kind of a paper trail. For the other parts of the system, it's certainly useful for prosecution of these cases, and it's useful in battery intervention, too, because we use those reports, as a record of what was reported about abusive behavior. I think probation is very important, for reinforcing the importance of the conditions of probation, and also of the goals, following the objectives of the battery intervention programs. Are they not just showing up, but are they actively participating in the program? I think victim programs are very important for providing support for victims, providing resources, for victims, really, every part of the system has its distinct role to play, and I think it's important for each part of the system to be very transparent in what it does and very consistent in its policies and procedures.
Do you have protocols that you sign or develop for that?
Yeah, we in Massachusetts, as part of our certification standards, we are required to have linkage agreements, with other partners, other parts of the system. And so we have cooperative agreements with our battered women's programs, our refuges, for instance, where we actually ask them to come in and observe our groups, every 2 years to provide a written report of feedback. We rely on them to train our group leaders, and we oftentimes do joint community educational presentations with them, too. We have cooperative agreements or linkage agreements with our probation departments, where we agree to provide regular monthly reports to them. They agree to provide copies of police reports and criminal records to us. So again, it's really important for us to be transparent about what our roles are and what kind of cooperation we can expect from each other.
Thank you, David. Now, thank you for coming to Australia and sharing your expertise. I know we've all learned so much from you. It's been very inspiring and something for us to work for here.
Thank you. It's never a pleasure to be here.